Snow filled the mountain bowl until the world turned white and sound went flat. 12 soldiers moved in a slow, tactical column, knees lifting high through drifts that reached the tops of their boots. Captain Daniel Brooks set the pace from the front, while his map stayed tucked under a clear sleeve. The line kept interval by feel, more than sight, as visibility slid toward 15 meters. Lieutenant Julia Monroe walked the middle and checked sectors with calm hand signals. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane floated the gaps, reading posture and distance, then nudging people back into the right spacing. Private First Class Emma Bennett kept the handset close to her chest and tried to shield it from the wind. The radio faded and returned like a weak heartbeat on SINGARS or an ANPRC, 152, with intermittent hop. Specialist Mark Rivera stumbled twice and rose each time slower than before. His cheeks held that paper gray that cold gives when it climbs inside the skin. Kane tapped his elbow and pushed a heat pack into a glove, then checked his grip on the M4A1. The rest of the rifles rode low on slings, 30-round magazines locked in and treated with cold weather lubricant that stayed thin in the freeze. Ava Ward walked last with a rifle case across her back and a quiet that drew almost no eyes. Her call sign was Viper, but here she was, labeled just Overwatch. Rear security. Eyes out. No shooting unless told to. She took that boundary in without comment and let her steps fall into the same clean rhythm as everyone else. The hard rule lived in her head the way a safety rule lives in a range brief. No fire unless authorized. Remain in rear Overwatch unless the unit faces imminent threat and command and control is cut. She accepted the chain and watched the weather work to erase it. At a short halt behind snow-covered boulders, someone muttered that she was only a designated marksman and not part of the real fight. Another voice said her big case looked heavier than it helped. Ava let the words pass like wind over a ridge. She put the case down and worked. She cracked the latches and brought out the Macmillan TAC 50 inches. 50 BMG. A precision tool that looked almost out of place in a storm this close. She checked torque on the optic ring with a small driver, then adjusted parallax for near distance and set the diopter until the reticle snapped sharp. Eye relief fell into place when she settled her cheek. A worn patch on the trigger finger glove showed where countless hours had lived before this day. Her range card was handwritten and wrapped in plastic. Mill holds sat in neat rows, with cold, dense air noted near the top and a blank line, ready for the next wind call. A small strip of tape on the stock carried a trimmed dope card she could read by feel more than sight. She wrote one pencil mark, then slid the card back under the tape. The team shifted forward again, and the column regained its shape. M4. A1 rifles stayed on safe until needed, and muzzles dipped when bodies crossed tight. Brooks pointed toward a spur that promised shelter, and Monroe nodded without breaking stride. Kane called a quiet check on magazines by buddy teams, and heard the soft clicks of hands counting by touch. Bennett tried the radio again and pulled only static. She cupped the microphone against the wind and got a thread of voice that snapped in and out. It was enough to mark a possible exfil point if the weather opened even a little. Then the noise came back and the net went thin. Ava drifted to the rear boulder at each pause and built the same small nest. She laid the TAC 50 across a pack, confirmed natural point of aim, and dry fired once to feel a clean 3.5-pound break. The selector stayed on safe while she logged movement and wind in a notebook that rode high in a chest pocket. Snow crystals in the lee of the rock told her more than the air on her face. She watched the tree line for the way shapes point when they listen. She watched muzzle bloom bend in the gusts and measured the gap between bursts. She looked for the ridge where bodies tilt their heads to hear a voice that carries. She saw a line form in that direction and filed it in her notes. Calories burned like paper in a trash fire. Breath frosted before it left the balaclava and fell in crumbs that stuck to the collar. Rivera began to move like a man whose battery sat at the last bar. Kane shifted him inward, where wind cut less, and put a steady hand on his pack. The storm narrowed the world to a tunnel, and the tunnel got shorter. 15 meters felt like a wall at the end of a hallway that kept shrinking. The team used every rock and tree to steal a little cover and a little concealment. The path to the exfil point ran under their boots, but the mountain wanted them to miss it. Ava kept her lane. Rear Overwatch meant eyes, not noise. She checked eye relief again because small things mattered when big things failed. The worn glove patch touched the trigger for a breath, then lifted away because the rule still held. Kane called a short halt, and Brooks broke the column into a tight perimeter with boulders for bones. Monroe reset sectors, so arcs met but did not overlap. Bennett swapped a radio battery with hands that shook and then steadied when the new one seated. Rivera tucked his chin into his collar and drew 2 slow breaths that did not fix the cold but pushed it back for a minute. Ava folded the bipod and stood to move, then paused to tape a fresh pencil line on the stock. Wind shifted left to right, and she wrote the change in short numbers she would remember even if the page blew away. The dope card sat smooth under the tape, like a promise she would keep if told to. She closed the case halfway so the latch would not ice. The whiteout pressed close, and the noose feeling tightened, even as no one spoke it. The ground rose in small steps that felt bigger with each minute. The exfil point sat somewhere ahead, where the map said it should be. But the storm tried to turn the map into myth. The unit kept moving, quiet and deliberate, because that is what disciplined soldiers do when the weather votes against them. Ava lifted the rifle again and felt the stock settle into the same place it always did. She checked the optic to make sure the glass stayed clear and the reticle stayed true. The rule still lived in her head, and she honored it. She scanned the rear arc and waited for the next signal to move. Ready to be only what she was labeled. Ready to do only the small things perfectly until something larger was required. The wind pressed fine snow into every seam of fabric until gear felt heavier than it looked. Ava Ward used the lull to triple-check the Macmillan tack 50 inches. 50 BMG without fuss or show. She settled behind a boulder and let bone carry the rifle's weight while she confirmed natural point of aim. Muzzle stayed disciplined. Safety on. Eye relaxed behind glass that filled with a crisp reticle. She verified eye relief so the sight picture ran edge to edge with no shadow. Parallax went to the right mark for a mid-distance engagement in thick air. Her finger found the trigger and she dry-fired once to feel a clean 3.5-pound break. The striker fall was a tiny click swallowed by the storm. Ava opened a small notebook sealed in plastic and updated a handwritten range card. She noted cold, dense air, a barometric pressure line trending down, and drift patterns that carried snow left to right. Millholds sat in neat columns with room for quick pencil updates. The dope card taped to the stock got the same treatment with short, blocky numbers. Snow crystals at the edge of the boulder turned into wind vanes if you looked closely enough. Ava watched how they hopped and spun along the stone before lifting off. The motion told her more than a weather report could offer in this valley. She marked wind near 22 knots from the northwest and moved on. Out at the tree line, the light bled in and out with each gust. Muzzle flashes bent in the wind like weak stars behind thin cloud. The pattern was faint, but consistent enough to chart lanes and likely positions. Ava counted the seconds between bursts and matched them to how shapes shifted along the ridge. She kept her breathing on a steady 4 in and 8 out cadence. The rhythm settled her pulse and kept the sight picture from bobbing. It also warmed a thin layer of air inside the mask that made thinking easier. Calm was a choice, and she made it on purpose. She reached into a pouch and pressed an IR chem light under the lip of an overhang. The mark was invisible to naked eyes, but bright to the right optics. It built a breadcrumb without calling attention. If the team had to break contact fast, the route would already be drawn. A spare 5-round magazine rode in the same place on her kit every time. She staged it where her glove could find it in the dark by feel alone. The latch got a quick pressure check to confirm it was seated. Nothing rattled. Nothing snagged. Nothing wasted motion. Two soldiers glanced back and saw a lot of small movements and a big rifle. One shrugged like it was overkill for a supposed designated marksman. The other turned away with a head shake that said the same thing without words. Ava kept the selector on safe and let the boulder take the wind. Team details stayed simple and right because small things kept people alive. M4. A 1 rifles rode on slings with 30-round magazines and cold-weather lubricant that did not gum up. Singars or ANPRC 152 radios faded and pulsed in the gusts. So, batteries got rotated on a strict plan. Gloves preserved trigger feel and eye protection, fogged at the edges, which meant steady clearing by swipe and tuck. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane moved down the line and checked hands, faces, and posture. Lieutenant Julia Monroe called minor sector nudges with 2 fingers and a nod. Captain Daniel Brooks stared into the white and made distance with patience, not speed. The element held a quiet shape as the storm wrapped tight around it. Ava's awareness ran ahead of her rank, and she did not need to say so. She watched where bodies at the tree line turned their heads when the wind dropped for a breath. That tilt pointed toward slightly higher ground on the far side of the clearing. Orders flowed from that pocket like ripples from a stone. Her cheek settled again on the stock, and the reticle found a stable float. She blinked once and checked parallax a second time because the air kept changing. A short pencil line went on the dope tape where her glove could trace it later without light. The numbers were not perfect, but they were close enough to matter when seconds got thin. Bennett fought the radio in the wind shadow and coaxed a flash of signal. The net said little and then went back to snow. Kane touched Rivera's shoulder and slid him into the windbreak without breaking the line. Brooks lifted a hand, and they all took 1 step forward, as if tied by a cord. Ava looked once more at the crystals along the rock and at the faint muzzle bloom across the way. She checked that the bipod legs were locked and that the sling did not drag across anything sharp. The selector stayed on safe because the rule still applied. Calm and restraint did not slow her down. They set the floor for speed later. She capped the pencil and tucked the notebook away. Her gloves brushed the tape on the stock and felt fresh graphite press into the fibers. The tape held a final hint in tight print for anyone who knew how to read it. Wind hold near 1 mil left and elevation near 0.7 mil at 300 meters, with a 100 meter zero written clean for when quiet turned into action. The trail narrowed as the whiteout thickened and the column bent around a line of snow-covered boulders. Captain Daniel Brooks raised a glove, and the 12-soldier element slid into a temporary hold near the planned exfil point. Interval closed to what the weather allowed, while muzzles stayed down when bodies crossed. The world beyond 15 meters was a moving wall of gray. Lieutenant Julia Monroe moved through the center with quiet hand signs and a steady face. She assigned sectors with 2 fingers and a nod, then checked that arcs met without overlap. Her map stayed tucked, but the terrain was read by memory and touch. Each rifleman shifted a boot length to seal a seam in the perimeter. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane ghosted the gaps the way good NCOs do when time runs short. He ran a fast ammunition check by buddy teams and marked anyone who needed a magazine later. He tugged sleeves and adjusted hoods to keep heat trapped where it mattered. Cold weather layers were set tight, but the wind still found edges. Specialist Mark Rivera showed the kind of fatigue that does not ask permission. His hands shook as he reset the sling on his M4A1, and his lips held the gray of a candle snuffed too fast. Kane slid him into the wind shadow and pushed a heat pack into a glove. He stayed on the line because everyone did. Private First Class Emma Bennett fought the Singar's net and then tried an ANPRC 152 that would not stop fading. She shielded the handset against the gusts and coaxed a few words before it went to snow again. Battery management turned into a rhythm of swaps and pocket warmth. The storm ate radios the way it ate distance. Ava Ward took rear overwatch and made herself part of a fallen pine and a high drift like she had drilled it 1,000 times. She carried the Macmillan TAC 50 cold and on safe, with the bolt closed on an empty chamber until she needed it to be more. Her role was eyes, notes, and the quiet protection of the rear arc. She did not argue with labels because work speaks louder. The move to the hold site stayed textbook in a way that only trained soldiers can make it. The element approached in a tactical column with spacing by feel, then collapsed into a tight defensive cluster that used the boulders and tree line for cover and concealment. M4, A1, rifles sat on slings with 30-round magazines that had been treated with cold weather lubricant so nothing gummed. Face protection fogged and cleared in a cycle that took patience and habit. Ava scanned without hurry and without the need to narrate what she saw. Faint muzzle flashes bloomed through the wind like dull stars that leaned a little left before they died. Shapes at the tree line shifted in small ways that said men were listening to someone uphill. Drifting snow drew pale lines across the ravine that mapped the crosswind better than any device. Monroe moved a fire team 2 steps to the right and kept them low. Kane corrected a foot position that brought a muzzle too close to rock. Then checked another set of gloves for trigger feel. Brooks watched the gaps in the boulders the way a pilot reads gauges. He set the perimeter with small, exact choices that cost no time. Ava kept her discipline tight because restraint is what keeps people alive when sightlines collapse. The TAC 50 rested across her pack, and glass stayed clear with routine swipes. Selector remained on safe, and the muzzle cut angles the team could not see from the center. She logged movement and wind in a notebook that lived high on her chest, so she did not have to hunt for it later. Bennett called a fragment of traffic and then lost it the way surf steals words from a beach. She made a note of a time hack that meant little in the storm but would matter later as 2:30 p.m. drifted toward 3. Kane handed Rivera a sip of warm water and counted breaths with him until a little color came back. Monroe traced the edge of an arc with a glove and nodded to the rifleman who owned it. The clock felt slower and faster at the same time. Snow weighed down straps and packs and minds, and the cold narrowed every decision to the next clean step. No one asked for speed because speed breaks things in weather like this. The plan needed a window, and the weather kept slamming it shut. Ava read the ridge across the clearing the way a carpenter reads grain. Bodies turned to it when the gusts dropped, and then snapped away as if a voice had finished a line. That pocket sat a touch higher than the trees and a little back from the lip. She marked it as a likely command element and wrote one short line on the dope tape for later reference. Chain of command and rules of engagement stayed simple enough to stand in the wind. Brooks commanded. Monroe set sectors. Kane enforced the basics that keep rifles and people working. Ava awaited authorization to fire, unless the unit faced an imminent threat and command and control had been cut. The storm did not change the rule. It only tested it. Glove discipline mattered in small ways that add up when fingers go numb. Triggers were felt, not slapped. Magazines were checked for seating by tug rather than hope. Batteries were warmed in inside pockets and rotated before they died instead of after. The visibility held near 15 meters and then dipped lower, like someone dimmed a light that was already weak. The perimeter pulled in and shoulders leaned into stone. Breath crystallized and fell on collars like powdered glass. Every step taken to get here turned into heat that could not be spared. Ava stayed still enough to hear her own heartbeat settle. She tracked the wind line over the ravine and the slow sway of branches that did not belong to trees. She held her fire because the order remained and because waiting is a kind of action when you do it on purpose. Her pencil rested on the notebook where the numbers would go when they were needed. The section closed on a quiet truth that everyone felt. The team was in the fight by staying put and by staying ready. Ava was in the fight by watching and by writing and by keeping a cold rifle safe until it had to be more. Across the clearing, a pocket of higher ground gathered decisions that would come their way. And she saw it first, then chose not to shoot. The first impact hit about 30 meters left and turned snow into a wall of white spray. The thump rolled through the defensive cluster and shook helmets and ribs. Powder fell in sheets and filled every seam of fabric. People blinked hard and reset their footing without breaking the perimeter. AK bursts stitched the wind in short lines that felt controlled and practiced. Tracers bent and broke in the gusts and then vanished. Overlapping fields of fire tightened from angles the team could not see. The cluster pulled in and used stone and wood the way a ship uses a reef. Communications slid into white noise on SINGARs, and then on the ANPRC 152. Frequency hop did not save the link in this storm. Every call came back as static, or half a syllable. Attempts to reach a retrans or higher died in the same gray wall. Captain Daniel Brooks kept the perimeter intact by force of steady presence. He moved little and watched the seams where arcs could split. His hands gave simple cues that did not waste breath. He set an order that felt small, but held the team together. Lieutenant Julia Monroe reassigned sectors and confirmed fields of fire with calm. Even moves. She checked that arcs met and did not overlap. Then shifted a rifle off a rock that kicked rounds high. Her face stayed still while the wind did its work. She made space for people to think. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane ran a fast ammunition count by buddy teams. Magazines sat at about 60% and dropping. He marked who needed a swap and who had a partial to share. He kept eyes on hands and faces as much as on gear. Specialist Mark Rivera stumbled, caught himself, and then sagged against a boulder. Cold had settled deep and would not leave without help. Kane slid him a heat pack and tucked it into a glove. A second soldier braced Rivera's elbow and shared body heat without breaking his sector. Private First Class Emma Bennett fought the handset and the storm that ate batteries like candy. She ran a swap and checked the cradle by feel, then cupped the mic to cut wind. A thin voice touched the net and then snapped apart. She logged the time as 2:40 p.m. and kept working the antenna for inches of signal. Air support was a firm no because the weather wrote the rules today. Medical evacuation was the same answer. The team would live with what they carried and what they could do. That fact sat heavy but clear in every chest. M4, A1, rifles stayed on safe until eyes were sure. 30-round magazines seated with a tug that confirmed lock. Cold weather lubricant kept actions thin and honest in the freeze. Eye protection fogged at the edges and needed a wipe that never lasted long. Under fire, the team ran short controlled pairs and let the discipline carry the day. Muzzle awareness stayed tight inside, crowded cover where a slip could cut a friend. When a carbine hiccuped, the hands did what they had practiced. Tap the magazine, rack the charging handle, reassess, and return to the fight. The whiteout kept visibility near 15 meters and sometimes worse. Muzzle flashes were faint and looked farther than they were because sound bent in the wind. People wanted to judge range by ear and got lies for their effort. The storm taught hard lessons without mercy. The cost of staying in place grew more real with each minute. If the cluster hunkered any longer, the enemy would collapse the pocket within 10 to 15 minutes. Casualties would stack, and the mission would fail by simple math. The perimeter felt like a clock, with hands that moved faster the longer you watched. Ava Ward held rear Overwatch behind a drift and a fallen pine. The Macmillan TAC 50 stayed cold and on-safe, with the bolt closed on an empty chamber. She logged movement and wind with the same neat hand as always. She tracked the probable command element by pattern rather than faces. Her glass found the way bodies tilted at the tree line when the wind eased. Orders rippled from a point on slightly higher ground. She marked it and recorded how often shapes moved after a faint muzzle bloom. She did not fire because authorization had not been granted, and command and control was degraded but not lost. Brooks kept voices short and spared the net. Monroe checked arcs and leaned into a soldier's shoulder to fix a small angle. Kane shifted a partial magazine forward and put a full one in the coldest hands. The cluster breathed as one unit and waited for a plan that the weather would allow. Another impact landed closer and pushed a wave of snow across the boulders. Fragments pattered on helmets and died in the drifts. People checked themselves and their neighbors and then reset grips. The line held because it had to. AK bursts came in sets that hinted at a push and then faded. The pattern looked like a tightening noose rather than a rush. The enemy had time and numbers and terrain, and they were not in a hurry. They pressed without exposing their center. Bennett tried another battery and got half a call sign before the voice dropped. She marked 3:05 p.m. and shook feeling back into her hands. The handset lived under her chin and inside her collar to steal a degree of warmth. She kept trying because that is what specialists do when the link is life. Rivera slipped again, and this time stayed down for 2 breaths. Kane crouched behind him and lifted his sling clean over a boot so it would not tangle. He put the rifle back into Rivera's hands and set his shoulder against a rock. The sector did not go dark. Ava watched the ravine for crosswind and the slight twist of drifting snow that marks a gap. She felt her breath settle into 4 in and 8 out and held to it. The selector stayed on safe and the muzzle cut arcs only she could see. She waited because the rule was still the rule. The whiteout made sound lie about distance and direction. Shots that were close felt far, and shots that were far echoed in your chest. The team learned to trust sight and touch more than ear. The learning cost time that they did not have. Kane called another ammunition check, and the numbers slid toward 50%. The drop was steady because fire discipline was holding, but it was a drop all the same. He planned a redistribution across buddy teams and kept 2 magazines in a pocket under his coat so they would not go brittle. He worked the basics because basics win fights. Monroe moved 2 rifles by half a step to close a seam that only she could see. She put a knee on a sling that drifted high and would have lifted a muzzle in the next gust. Her maps and lines were in her head now. And her head was right. She kept people from shooting where friends might be. Brooks did not overtalk and did not overreact. He kept his eyes and his mind on the next 3 minutes. He knew the window would open or it would not, and that the team had to be ready either way. His stillness made room for thinking under pressure. Ava pressed a pencil mark against the tape on her stock and wrote 1 small line. She noted the timing of a distant burst and the shift that followed at the tree line. The command pocket across the clearing flexed and then stilled. It waited like a stone in a current. The storm grew heavier, and the air felt like it was closing its hand. The circle tightened with patient force. Time moved slow and fast together in the way it does when risk climbs. The unit held fast and knew that without a change people would die. And the knowledge sat on every shoulder like fresh snow. The whiteout pressed close and turned distance into guesswork while the perimeter held its quiet shape. Ava Ward stayed in rear Overwatch, with the Macmillan TAC 50 carried cold and unsafe. Her body filled the gap between a drift and a fallen pine, and her eyes owned the rear arc. Breath ran in a steady 4 in and 8 out that kept the sight picture calm. Indirect fire thumped somewhere off the left and shook snow from branches in a soft curtain. Rifle fire skimmed rock in flat snaps that came and went with the wind. Inside that noise, Ava's hands moved in the same order they always did. She checked bolt throw, confirmed natural point of aim, and set the glass so the reticle sat clean. Captain Daniel Brooks kept control of the perimeter with shorthand cues and a quiet posture. He prioritized sectors that mattered and let silence do the rest. Lieutenant Julia Monroe adjusted fields of fire until overlaps were confirmed and blind spots were minimized. The cluster was tight, practical, and balanced against the weather. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane tracked ammunition by buddy teams and spoke in short phrases that carried more through a gloved tap than a voice. Magazines were dropping toward the halfway point and redistribution began to flow by touch. Specialist Mark Rivera fought deep cold that kept creeping up his arms and into his jaw. Kane steadied him, checked his face protection, and reset a hood that had crept open. Private First Class Emma Bennett swapped a fresh battery into an ANPRC 152 with fingers that had to work by feel. She cupped the handset inside her collar to keep the wind off the mic. The link faded, returned for a breath, and faded again. She held a thin thread of signal that might matter at 2:50 p.m. and logged it anyway. Ava performed baseline duty with clinical precision and no wasted motion. She slid to a shivering rifleman behind a boulder and steadied his stance without breaking his arc. Her glove tapped his forearm to cue short bursts with a clean trigger press and a reset you could feel. The carbine settled into controlled pairs that stayed on target without burning ammunition. When another rifle hiccuped, the fix was the one that gets taught until it lives in muscles. Tap the magazine to confirm seating. Rack the charging handle with a firm pull. Reassess the sight picture. And return to controlled pairs. Cold weather lubricant stayed thin and honest, even as frost tried to creep under dust covers. Eye protection fogged at the edges and was cleared with quick swipes that never took the muzzle offline. Ava kept her own weapon discipline tight and boring in the best way. The TAC-50 rested across a pack, with the crown clear of snow and the optic capped between scans. Selector stayed on safe until the reticle was on target, and the decision line was crossed. She logged movement and trends in the small notebook that lived in her chest pocket, so the pencil never had far to travel. She watched how faint muzzle flashes bent in gusts, and how they came in patterns that did not match random fire. Bodies at the tree line oriented toward a higher point on the far side of the clearing. That pocket held still when the wind died, and then sent ripples through the line when the gust returned. It looked like a command element, even if faces could not be seen. Positions were chosen for cover and concealment, with snow-covered boulders and the tree line doing the work. Intervals were kept as best as the storm allowed, and muzzles stayed inside angles that protected the team. M4. A-1 rifles rode in cold hands on slings, set for quick transitions, without sweeping a friend. Gloves preserved trigger feel and prevented the clumsy grip that cold tries to force. Brooks checked the right seam with a glance, and a two-finger cue that moved a rifle half a boot length. Monroe laid a gloved hand on a forearm to stop an unnecessary burst before it wasted a magazine. Kane slid a partial to a shooter who needed it and put a full magazine under his own coat so the feed lips stayed warm. Rivera took 2 careful sips of warm water and held the cup until feeling returned to his fingertips. Ava listened to the storm lie about distance and refused to trust sound. She read snowdrift lines that marked crosswind over the ravine and timed the lull that sometimes fell between gusts. Her breathing cadence stayed steady because it had to. Calm under pressure was not a trait. It was the outcome of practice done right. Bennett leaned into her wind shadow and caught a broken reply from somewhere beyond the ridge. The net went clear for 2 heartbeats, then died to static again. She marked the moment and swapped the spent battery into an inside pocket to steal back a degree of life. Her face told the truth and her hands kept working. Ava's notebook, filled with short lines that would mean everything later. She wrote holds and mills for wind that pushed left, and for elevation that barely needed lift at this distance in dense air. She tracked how often the tree line turned after a faint flash from the ridge. It was pattern recognition at work without announcement or drama. Outside, shock waves pushed powder into the air and set teeth on edge. Inside, Ava's hands kept doing the same tasks the same way, because routine is the scaffold that holds judgment steady. Bolt throw checked. Glass checked. Sling clear. Selector on safe. Ethics stayed in place even as the clock ran hot. Rules of engagement remained clear and present despite the weather and the pressure. Ava would not fire without authorization. And she knew that command and control were degraded but not yet gone. The order stood. So she honored it and stayed ready to act if the line crossed to imminent threat. Discipline spoke louder than bravado, and everyone could feel it. The team breathed in a rhythm that matched the storm, as if a metronome were set somewhere under the snow. Controlled pairs. Pause. Reassess. Hold. The cluster flexed but did not fracture. Every small correction kept the machine from grinding itself apart. Ava checked bolt throw again and pressed her cheek into the same spot on the stock until the muscle memory clicked. Her breath found that soft pause on the exhale where the sight calms. She let the pause pass because this was not the moment to break it. The selector stayed on safe and the muzzle stayed where it could do the most good without a shot. Minutes dragged and leapt in the way they do when cold and risk climb together. The situation was worsening and everyone knew it without saying it out loud. Ava kept modeling calm, competence, and restraint with every choice she made. She knew when to act and when to wait. And right now, she chose to wait. To think. And to keep her team alive by doing the small things perfectly. The Whiteout pinned the unit in place and turned the perimeter into a small island of breath and frost. Overlapping fields of fire pressed in from blind angles, and the sound of bursts slid in the wind like distant doors slamming. Visibility held near 15 meters and never gave more than a pale outline of trees and stone. The plan that looked simple on a map now felt brittle in a cold hand. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane crawled the ring and counted magazines with touches and nods. His numbers stepped down from about 60% toward 50% and kept moving in the wrong direction. He started a quiet shuffle of partials and full loads between buddy teams. Every swap bought minutes, not comfort. Captain Daniel Brooks stayed still and held the shape of the defense with short cues and steady eyes. Lieutenant Julia Monroe kept sectors clean and prevented arcs from kissing each other under stress. The circle still closed, no matter how neatly they set it. The weather took what it wanted, and time began to fold. Air support remained a hard no because the ceiling was a rumor and the valley was a bowl of milk. Medical evacuation sat in the same column as wishful thinking. The radios added insult by rolling to white noise on SINGARs and on the ANPRC 152 even with hop. Emma Bennett changed a battery and got only a hiss that sounded like the storm laughing. Ava Ward lay behind a snowdrift in a fallen pine with the Macmillan TAC 50 carried cold and on safe. She owned the rear arc with her eyes in her notebook while the rest of the line strained at the front. She watched patterns rather than faces because the weather bent vision and sound in bad ways. She did not fire because the rule still sat on her shoulder. She tried to request fire authorization with a brief, correct call that would not waste a syllable. The net collapsed in her ear and handed back half of a word and a rasp of static. She tried the retrans path and got the same answer dressed in different noise. The line that should grant permission was gone. The ethical hinge clicked into view like a sight picture that finally steadied. Rules of engagement mattered because they kept people honest when fear tried to lead. The unit had the right to act in self-defense when command and control were cut. The question was whether they were cut enough that waiting would kill friends. Concrete math did not care about feelings. Enemy elements were inside 70 meters and closing with the patience of hunters who knew how to read snow. The likely command element sat across the clearing on slightly higher ground at about 300 meters. She inferred it from how bodies oriented and how orders rippled through movement after each faint muzzle bloom. Realistic sensory cues did not flatter anyone. Sound bent and lied. So a close burst felt far, and a far burst shook the chest. Muzzle flashes were faint and displaced by wind that kept shifting from the northwest. Ava ignored faces because they did not exist in this soup, and instead read timing and angles the way she was trained to read them. She confirmed 3 factors in a quick inner checklist before she crossed any line. Command and control were degraded beyond use for the decision she needed. The threat to the unit was imminent because the pocket would collapse within minutes at the current rate. A precise, measured shot could remove the enemy commander and break the assault at its spine. Ava slid into a firing position with no wasted motion and let bone take the load. The snowdrift and the fallen pine turned into a rest that matched training muscle for muscle. Her optics sat where it should. Eye relief set. Parallax corrected. And glass clear against a dark reticle. The dope card on the stock waited with space for one more pencil note. She kept muzzle discipline honest and the selector on safe while she built the shot. Natural point of aim came first because anything else would cost when the heart thumped. She seated a 5-round magazine and verified a clean chamber by feel and sight. The gloves preserved trigger feel because they were chosen for this day and this job. She wrote a quick pencil line on the stock tape where her glove could find it later. Wind left near 1 mil. Elevation near 0.7 mil at 300 meters with a 100-meter zero in cold, dense air. The numbers were not perfect. But the shot did not need perfection to change the math. Her body settled into a bone-supported position that would let the rifle return to the same point after recoil. Breath cadence stayed 4 in and 8 out because a metronome calms chaos. Heart rate slid into the low 50s and made the reticle float in a slow, predictable drift. Panic lives in fast beats, and she had no use for it. The wind from the northwest pushed near 22 knots and deserved respect. She held near 1 mil into that full value push and lifted the reticle near 0.7 mil for elevation. She anticipated minor deflection if the bullet passed through a light curtain of snow that hung between trees. Certainty was a myth in weather like this. So commitment had to replace it. The countdown made the choice feel less like a choice and more like an honest duty. Rifle bursts stitched the boulders and sent chips of ice into gloves and sleeves. An impact thumped snow into the air and made everyone duck for a heartbeat. Rivera stumbled from the cold and needed a hand under the elbow to keep his arc alive. Bennett fought a fading battery and tried one more retrans. Then shook her head as the net fell apart again. Monroe called a sector shift that kept 2 arcs from overlapping and a muzzle from creeping into a friend's lane. Kane signaled another ammunition check and began a quiet redistribution that moved rounds toward the coldest hands. Brooks held the line and knew the window was shrinking. Ava ran her internal rule check one last time and framed it without emotion. The order to hold fire is valid until it results in preventable loss of life. Command and control for the decision at hand no longer functions. The enemy commander is directing an assault that will overrun this position if nothing changes. A precise shot can break that chain. She accepted the consequences as part of the job and not as a story about herself. There was no grandstanding in the way she moved her hand to the selector. There was only the quiet acknowledgement that rules exist to preserve life, not to consume it. She would preserve the lives of 12 Americans who trusted one another to do hard things well. The setup came clean and in sequence, because that is how you make hard shots under pressure. She eased the selector to fire, only when the reticle was stable on the space where geometry said the commander lived. She confirmed range by reticle subtension in mils rather than guessing at a blur in snow. She chose to hold rather than dial, to avoid ice on turrets and to save the seconds that get people killed. She braced the recoil path through bone so the rifle would return to the same point, not wander. The 3-step cadence governed her work, the way a checklist governs a cockpit. Confirm the target through pattern and geometry. Adjust the hold for wind and elevation. Solve the problem with one deliberate press and a full follow-through. Ethics stayed at the front, even as the trigger found the pad of her finger. She was not chasing glory and had no interest in the sound of a big round for its own sake. She was keeping faith with a higher duty that says you bring your people home when you can. The weight of that duty felt quiet and heavy and completely right. The storm did not pause to witness any of it. Snow hissed against the pine, and the ravine sent a ribbon of wind across the muzzle brake. The tree line tilted again in a way that confirmed her read on the command pocket. She felt the moment arrive more than she saw it. She ran one last look through the glass and checked that natural point of aim still matched what the reticle claimed. She held near 1 mil left for the wind, and near 0.7 mil up for elevation. The optic edges stayed clean, and the eye box felt generous enough that a blink would not cost the shot. The stock tape caught a smear of graphite that would make sense later. The unit was seconds from a breach if nothing changed. The reticle stopped wandering and held like a quiet breath on a winter window. Her breathing fell to a natural pause at the bottom of the exhale where the body is still. The trigger press began as a smooth, straight rear motion, that did not disturb the sight picture. Everything in that instant felt earned, disciplined, and necessary rather than loud. Outside, the assault curled tighter with patience and numbers. Inside, a single choice met it with geometry and duty. The story poised on the thin edge between restraint and action. And the fight began to turn because one soldier crossed the line to save lives. The whiteout pressed on the valley like a lid, while the line held its shape. Ava Ward settled behind the drift and the fallen pine and let bone take the rifle's weight. The Macmillan TAC-50 lay quiet. Optic clean. Selector on safe. Breath set to 4 in and 8 out. She felt the reticle float, then steadied it with the slow rhythm that made space for judgment. Her cadence lived in 3 steps that did not change under pressure. First, confirm. Second, adjust. Third, solve. The words did not leave her mouth, but they ran under every move her hands made. She confirmed the commander's position at roughly 300 meters by reading behavior, not faces. Bodies at the tree line tilted toward a pocket of slightly higher ground, then moved only after a faint flash from that same point. She used reticle subtension in mills to check distance against known widths of shoulders and trees in this terrain. The number lined up within a few meters, which was close enough for the math that mattered. She adjusted without touching turrets because ice on exposed metal stole seconds and stole reliability. Wind from the northwest pressed near full value at about 22 knots, which meant a significant lateral push. She held near 1 mil into the wind and lifted the reticle near 0.7 mil for elevation with a 100-meter zero in cold, dense air. She accepted that snow curtains could add minor deflection and built a small allowance into her sight picture. She solved from a bone-supported position that would return the TAC-50 to target after recoil. The trigger broke at a clean 3.5 pounds without a hint of jerk. Recoil came straight into her structure and rode through ribs and back rather than shoulders alone. The optic settled again before the echo finished rolling. Across the clearing, the commander dropped like a cord had been cut. The assault stalled in an instant that felt longer than it was. Shock moved through the formation as if it needed room to breathe. Then ate the next step they had planned. Wind carried the delay across the line and gave the unit a sliver of time. Ava saw it and kept her work inside the same cadence. She ran the bolt with no wasted motion and kept the muzzle exactly where discipline said it should be. The 5-round magazine had seated with a tactile check earlier, so the next feed was clean. Safety clicked back on while the reticle drifted off target and then came off only when her eye returned to glass. The second in command ducked behind a downed log and believed it made him safe. Ava made the fast assessment that the log offered concealment against small arms, not true cover against a 50 BMG round. Wood would shatter and throw the bullet off by a small angle rather than stop it. She planned for roughly 0.2 to 0.3 mil of drift after penetration and built that hold into the picture. She reconfirmed natural point of aim because that check saves misses. She felt the rifle settle into the same pocket on her shoulder and the same sling tension on her support arm. The breath cycle found the bottom of the exhale and held there without strain. The reticle floated where geometry said it should live. She pressed through a second clean break and felt the recoil return the rifle to where it started. The round hit the log with a sharp crack that the wind almost swallowed. Wood exploded forward and to the side as the core kept moving. The second in command folded out of sight and stayed down. And with him went the thread that tied the assault to timing. For 3 seconds, the battlefield held a breath that everyone could feel. It was the moment where reality caught up with what had happened and tried to understand it. Sound bent wrong in the whiteout, and still, the pause felt real. Then motion resumed. But now, it was motion without coherence. Every technical detail stayed simple and right, because that is how accuracy survives stress. The TAC-50 wore a properly mounted optic, with correct eye relief and parallax set for the shot distance. The 5-round magazine had been seated with a tug that confirmed lock. The selector had remained on safe until the reticle steadied on target, then moved to fire for only the seconds needed. Ava kept muzzle awareness tight and stayed inside the rules of engagement by acting under imminent threat as command and control had collapsed for her element. She read wind using the behavior of snow crystals at the edge of her cover. She noted the way faint flashes bent in gusts and how that shift matched her earlier estimates. She wrote a quick pencil update on the stock tape so the wind and elevation holds would live in the after-action review. Captain Daniel Brooks kept the perimeter steady and did not surrender shape to surprise. His eyes tracked the cadence and the control rather than the noise. Lieutenant Julia Monroe recognized the mill-based range confirmation and the choice to hold instead of dial to save time under ice. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane noted the flawless bolt work and the way the rifle returned on target without drama. Specialist Mark Rivera and Private First Class Emma Bennett felt the concussive report of a 50 BMG in their ribs. Even so, the blast seemed contained by Ava's position and body mechanics, and it rolled away instead of punching inward. They were stunned that someone acted when the storm ate voices. They were more stunned by how it looked when it happened, with no wasted movement and no panic. 3 compact metrics framed the difficulty without burying anyone in jargon. Distance sat near 300 meters. Wind held near 22 knots from the northwest. Visibility stayed near 15 meters while sound bent and gave false reads. The recoil was heavy but returned straight. The muzzle blast rolled, but the storm dampened it. And the flash was muted by snow while the brake controlled gas. Ava thought in patterns and geometry rather than noise. She held for wind in mills, lifted for elevation, confirmed stability, and pressed the trigger straight to the rear. She did not chase heroics because the job was to remove the link that made the assault coherent. The result was a visible shift in power as enemy elements scattered and discipline cracked. Brooks kept control of sectors with short, clipped lines and did not overtalk the net. Monroe checked overlaps in the blind and kept arcs from crossing where they should not. Kane continued ammo redistribution by buddy teams, now that pressure was easing. Ava did not step into command that was not hers. She kept spotting patterns, spoke in the 1 or 2 lines that mattered, and stayed in her lane as a long-range Overwatch. Correct post-shot actions followed as if written into muscle. Ava tracked through recoil to confirm impact, then held the reticle steady long enough to spot any need for a correction. She ran the bolt, checked the chamber by feel when the second opened a beat of time, and put the safety back on when the glass came off target. She logged temperature, wind estimate, elevation hold used, and impact result in 2 spare lines. She swapped a magazine position in her kit so the next feed would be easiest to reach by touch. She kept her heat management steady by closing the jacket collar after the shot rather than letting sweat freeze. Her breathing rhythm did not change, because the same rhythm that steadied the first shot steadied the space that followed. The routine protected decisions when adrenaline tried to write new rules. Ballistics and weather stayed inside the borders of what real rifles do in real air. The 50 BMG carried serious velocity at 300 meters, which meant good effect on target while still respecting drift. Snow curtains could turn a near-perfect line into a near-miss if you asked too much of them. So she planned for small deflections rather than ignore them. She chose effect on the command chain over a perfect center hit because that choice saved time and lives. The team's emotional tone reset from resignation to focused work in the space of a few breaths. They did not cheer or break discipline. They settled into cleaner arcs and cleaner bursts because now the fight had room to be professional again. Ava stayed almost anonymous and used that anonymity to keep scanning for the next angle. Her eyes went back to glass with the selector on safe because safety off target and safe on target would have been backward. She watched how the tree line came apart when the head was gone from the body. She saw groups that had been one shape slip into three shapes and point in three different directions. She listened for the kind of call that could knit them back together and did not hear it. Brooks sent a small reposition that pulled the cluster out of a bad angle without opening a new one. Monroe confirmed that two sectors still met where they should, and that no fratricide risk had crept into the edges. Kane used the lull to finish a redistribution that left two rifles ready when the others went to reload. The element regained initiative on the ground while the storm still tried to take it away. Ava wrote down one more wind note and a slight drop in gust strength that might matter if a third shot became necessary. She did not chase it. She left it on the tape where it would wait like a line on a map. The breathing stayed even, and the rifle rested across the pack, with the crown clear of the snow. The enemy did not break all at once, but the line of their advance lost its spine. Where there had been a rhythm, there were only short pushes that died without follow-through. Where there had been an angle, there was only a crowd that could not decide which way to turn. The space that opened felt thin, but it was enough to use. Bennett caught a sliver of net and got a fragment back that confirmed the world had heard them. She let out a breath she had been holding since the first impact and wrote the time as 3:10 p.m., even though she could not feel her pen. Rivera kept his arc and found a stance that his legs would honor for more than a minute. Kane checked fingers and toes with a brief touch and moved on. Ava's job did not change because the fight had tilted. She stayed where Overwatch belongs and let the glass do what it was built to do. She scanned for the kind of counterpush that sometimes follows a shock. But the tree line held no such discipline now. She placed her attention on the pockets where a new leader might rise and kept them marked in her mind. She ran another check on natural point of aim, because habits keep mistakes small. She breathed again through 4 in and 8 out. And the world shrank to a circle of clarity inside a field of white. The TAC-50 looked large in that space, but it felt light because its work had been exact. The team's work felt light too, because fear had a smaller voice now. Brooks kept the voice of command small and precise. Monroe ran the geometry of sectors as if she were drawing lines on a board no one else could see. Kane stayed with logistics and safety, which is the heart of any fight that lasts more than a minute. That rhythm pulled the unit back from the edge where cold and pressure had been trying to push them. Ava let the moment breathe and then captured what it meant in 3 short notes for the after-action review. Distance near 300 meters. Wind near 22 knots from the northwest. Visibility near 15 meters with sound bending. Those numbers would teach someone later why doing the small things right under pressure is not luck. She thought once about what the shots had changed and then put the thought away. Thinking about effect too long gets in the way of seeing the next problem. Pattern and geometry. Wind and elevation. Confirm and adjust and solve. The sequence stayed ready in her head without demanding attention it did not need. The enemy command structure was now a gap rather than a center. Their assault collapsed into confusion that ran like water downhill. The United States element stood on firmer ground because someone had removed the piece that made the enemy's plan work. They finally had room to plan an exfil that might carry them through the weather. Ava left the selector back on safe and kept her cheek near the stock without committing to glass for more than a few seconds at a time. She stayed still enough to be part of the drift and the pine, yet alert enough to be first to see any shape that mattered. Breath stayed even. Shoulders stayed low. The rifle waited. She was ready to act again if needed. But the point had been made without a word. Elite skill looked like quiet choices made in order. Not noise. It looked like mill holds written in pencil and a reticle that came back to the same place after recoil. It looked like a team that gained a sliver of time and space to live because someone knew how to turn math into survival. The storm did not care and did not stop. Snow kept falling on boulders and faces and gear that felt heavier than before. The difference was that now the unit moved inside a pattern they controlled. That was enough for the next step. And sometimes the next step is the only step that matters. Snow kept falling as if it meant to fill the world. Yet the field felt different the moment the two shots rippled through it. The enemy line that had moved like a single shape broke into pieces that disagreed with each other. The United States element stayed tight in the whiteout and let discipline be the anchor. Power shifted without noise and with no change in rank. Captain Daniel Brooks held overall control with short perimeter commands that sounded like clean steps. He had the element hold the south boulder and maintain interval by touch. He reminded rifles to keep muzzles inside tight cover and to stay off the slope where rounds could climb. The cluster began to feel like a plan instead of a barricade. Lieutenant Julia Monroe walked the seams and adjusted sectors in small increments. She checked overlaps by body angle and confirmed arcs in the blind with quick glove gestures. She prevented fratricide by pulling two shooters a half pace apart so their lines did not cross near the tree line. Her movements were quiet geometry in layers of cold. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane ran ammunition status by buddy teams and carried numbers in his head like a second map. He moved partial magazines to the shooters who needed them most and kept full loads warm under his coat. Small problems got fixed fast because small problems become big ones in cold wind. He put his hand on a shoulder when a glove crept toward a trigger without intent, and the reminder stuck. Ava Ward stayed in her Overwatch lane and still managed to influence the field. Her lines were precise and minimal and came only when they mattered. She called a ravine approach on the east that had gone unnoticed in the blur of snow. She marked a shallow dead space on the south boulder that could hide a push and then return to glass. Commands sounded like soldiers, not speeches. And they worked. Brooks called hold south boulder. Monroe adjusted 2 left. Kane covered the ravine. Burst went to a 2 count that told everyone the team meant to conserve rounds and control breath. A stovepipe on a carbine appeared like a problem and vanished like a drill. The shooter ran tap. Rack. Reassess without being told, and then went back to short pairs. Kane tightened a sling for faster shoulder transitions so the rifle could work both sides around stone. He corrected a foot placement that kept muzzle awareness inside cover and kept a good shooter from leaning his barrel into rock. Ava kept the Macmillan TAC 50 on safe when off target and let the optic do the hard part. She scanned with glass, logged 2 lines in her notebook, and closed the cover with a steady hand. Breath stayed on a 4-in and 8-out rhythm that kept the reticle smooth even when the wind lied. Calm made information useful and voice precise. The team began to move like one organism again. Breathing steadied into a cadence that matched the weather and not the fear. Fire control tightened and cut waste without anyone saying the word. The perimeter became a plan rather than a circle, and that difference kept the cold from feeling personal. Communications came back in small, believable steps, and not all at once. Private First Class Emma Bennett got a thin thread of signal on an ANPRC 152 after a battery swap and a short shift behind the boulder. A fragment from Overwatch 7 reached her, and she answered with trained muscle. She called for authentication and waded through the hiss. Security on the net stayed clean. Overwatch used a code word challenge to confirm the asset without exposing a name. And Bennett relayed it. Confirm Raven. 6 present came soft through noise. Captain Brooks replied with a correct response and a tone that did not waste words. Affirm Raven. 6 operational. No one used the call sign that did not belong on an open net. Radio traffic remained sparse and professional because empty talk wastes oxygen and heat. Overwatch advised that weather limits stayed hard and that no air support was inbound yet. The element needed to stabilize and prep for exfil options when a window opened. Respect began to crystallize around form rather than story. Brooks glanced toward Ava's position once, then stayed in his lane because command sits where it sits. Monroe recognized the geometry in Ava's spotting and mirrored it in sector assignments that cut angles rather than chase shadows. Kane noted the clean bolt work and the way Ava placed information exactly where it helped and nowhere else. Specialist Mark Rivera and other riflemen reflected the shift by syncing their short bursts to the metronome of breath. They held fire when lines were unclear because discipline beats noise in Whiteout. The tone changed in a way you could feel more than hear. The unit stopped bleeding time and started buying it back. Technical details kept their footing because reality demands it. M4. A1. Rifles with 30-round magazines rode on slings set for quick transitions and stayed on safe until eyes were sure. Gloves preserved trigger feel, while eye protection fogged at the edges in the wind and needed occasional clearing. Radios ran SINGARs, or ANPRC, 152, with intermittent signal and careful battery management tucked under jackets. Positions used cover and concealment from snow-covered boulders and tree line that rolled like a low wall in the storm. Intervals were maintained as best as conditions allowed, because space is safety when bullets move. Ava's Macmillan tack, 50 inches. 50 BMG stayed a precision tool employed with mill-based holds and a dope card on the stock. Safety went on when she was off target and off only when she was on target and ready. Pattern spotting kept upgrading survival in quiet. Steady increments. Ava called a likely counter-push lane that threaded a shallow depression toward the north arc. Then let Monroe make the move. Monroe shifted a fire team to cover it without creating overlaps that risked fratricide. Kane staggered reloads, so 2 rifles did not go cold at once and kept magazines staging in warm pockets. Brooks authorized a micro-reposition that pulled the cluster out of enfilade by inches that mattered. He did it with a hand signal and a look that said, "Keep it small." The language stayed plain and unadorned. The leadership lived in small decisions that stacked and not in lines that echoed. A brief moment of human steadiness made the cold feel less sharp. Rivera got a hand on the shoulder and a calm line about breathing and counting shots that he could follow. Bennett heard the net clear for 3 seconds and squeezed in a precise check that confirmed no friendly forces were forward of the ravine. Kane gave a nod that meant stay with it. We are back in rhythm. Wind dropped for a heartbeat and then returned, and Ava noted it without acting. She wrote the change on the stock tape with a quick pencil mark and let the next gust prove the adjustment right. The point was not to chase every tick. The point was to keep the picture honest when a real choice came. Brooks maintained overall control and watched for the moment when a route and a window could meet. He spoke in short perimeter commands that cut confusion down to 1 beat at a time. Monroe kept pressing arcs into clean shapes and stopped gaps from reopening. Kane kept logistics at the front of the fight because full magazines and warm fingers are tactics when the mercury falls. The enemy at the tree line showed their new shape by accident. Stray bursts replaced coordinated pushes, and small clusters moved without a shared purpose. A pair of figures tried the shallow dead space on the south boulder and ran into a sector that was already waiting. Another group hovered near the ravine and then backed away from a line that had just strengthened. Ava stayed on safe and worked the optic rather than the trigger, because influence is not always a shot. She called the ravine to Kane with 1 sentence and let him translate it into rounds and posture. She called the shallow depression to Monroe and watched a rifle slide into it like it had always belonged. Her voice was reserved for what mattered, and it carried because it was rare. Bennett eased the handset under her collar again and let the battery live in the warm place against her chest. She checked times in natural spoken form and logged that the thread held at about 3:20 p.m. Overwatch sent 1 more line that the window might open and then went quiet to listen. The radio felt like a lifeline rather than a burden for the first time in an hour. Kane found a shooter whose sling fought his shoulder transition and fixed it with a twist that turned the rifle into a faster tool. He kept fingers moving so no one locked up. He swapped a partial into a slot where a full had been and prevented a rifle from going dry at the wrong second. He worked the line like a mechanic with a living engine. Monroe crouched beside a young rifleman whose eye protection had fogged at the edges and taught him how to clear it without lifting his cheek. She redrew his arc with a glove and made sure he could see the line in his mind, even when he could not in the storm. She moved on before he could say thanks because time is expensive in weather like this. Her face stayed steady and the steadiness spread. Brooks watched the south boulder hold and then rolled his focus to the east ravine that Ava had called. He saw the same small signs that she had and trusted the lane that Monroe had covered. He did not rush the next step and did not speak more than he had to. Control does not always sound like volume. Ava logged 2 more lines in the notebook that would become training for someone she would never meet. Wind, orientation shifts, and the timing between flashes that no longer matched a plan. She felt the rifle rest across the pack and let the breathing cadence stay easy. She knew that restraint buys options when storms try to sell panic. Step by step, the status change became real and not just a feeling. Enemy movement at the tree line turned into disorganized motion that did not know where to land. Bursts came from guns that were talking to themselves rather than to a net. The United States element shifted from defense to controlled stability that could think. They were ready to plan an exfil but would wait for the window rather than rush into new fire. The valley still held risk the way cold holds bone. But risk now had shape and edges that discipline could touch. The team stood on those edges and did not look down. They looked at each other and at the work. Ava kept glassing with the selector on safe and her breath even and steady. She stayed part of the drift and the pine and let her voice remain a tool used in measures, not in sprays. Her notes were short and legible, even with numb hands, because practice writes through weather. She held space for the next decision, without chasing the last one. The leadership in the bowl had shifted not by titles, but by competence used in the right measure at the right time.
Steady, we're hitting heavy wind.
Brooks remained the center by speaking little and seeing
Adjusting
far.
throttle.
Monroe held the geometry of survival in the shape of arcs and the placement of boots. Kane kept the machine oiled with rounds and heat and simple corrections that saved seconds and lives. Snow still fell and the wind still lied. But the unit stood inside a pattern that belonged to them. That pattern kept fear small and made room for thinking. The enemy felt the loss of their center and turned it into noise. The team turned their center into quiet. Ava breathed in for 4 and out for 8 and kept her eye near the glass without living in it. She let the TAC 50 rest because precision is not a constant need. She watched the field and believed in the choices that had brought them here. The fight would move again. And when it did, the team would be first to see the next truth because now they were looking with the same eyes. The moment the enemy command snapped, space opened like a thin seam in heavy ice. Captain Daniel Brooks caught it first and moved without raising his voice. Lieutenant Julia Monroe folded sectors inward to seal the nearest gaps while keeping lines clean. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane counted magazines by touch and started moving partials to hands that would need them on the route. Ava Ward stayed in rear Overwatch with the Macmillan TAC 50 on safe and the bolt closed on a clean chamber. She scanned for a counterpush and spoke only when the picture sharpened. A ravine ran shallow along the east with a wind line that could hide a staggered file. A pocket of dead space hugged the south boulder where a short team could vanish for 10 steps. Brooks turned the seam into a plan that everyone could carry at speed. The concept was simple and strict. Ride the ravine hard. Feint on the eastern arc with 2-count bursts. And mark a pickup zone with IR strobes and chem lights that stayed shielded from enemy eyes. No one overtalked the net and no one moved before arcs were confirmed. Monroe drew the exfil lanes on the ground with posture and gloves. She set the staggered file, kept interval as terrain allowed, and reminded muzzles to point down when bodies crossed tight. Short halts would check arcs and confirm that sectors still touched and did not overlap. The Whiteout held near 15 meters and punished every sloppy angle. Kane pulled partial magazines from warm pockets and palmed them into the right kits. He checked gloves for trigger feel and pulled a loose sling into a position that made shoulder transitions faster. He did not let 2 rifles go cold at the same time. Every exchange saved seconds later, when seconds would matter most. Ava watched the tree line for the kind of surge that follows shock and saw only noise. She called pattern cues in short, exact lines that fit between bursts. The ravine line was clean for the next 30 meters, and the south boulder shadow stayed quiet. She kept the selector on safe because discipline buys options and ego burns them. The weather worked against them in visible ways. Wind gusts shoved drifts over footprints and erased confidence with each step. Snow blew off rock faces and made ghost movement where none existed. Radios on Singars, or ANPRC 152, came and went. So, Private First Class Emma Bennett warmed batteries inside her coat and cupped the handset to steal signal. Brooks announced the shift with plain soldier language. Hold South Boulder. Then roll east. Monroe pushed 2 left to keep arcs honest as the file bent into the ravine. Kane covered the ravine mouth and cued 2-count bursts for the feint. The perimeter loosened into a plan and did not leave a seam behind. The feint came first and looked professional rather than loud. A designated position on the eastern arc sent a 2-count burst into the wind to disguise movement without wasting ammunition. Smoke came out only once, and only to screen a single angle. And even that risked sheer in the gusts. The rest of the team moved on a quiet mark that felt like a shared breath. The staggered file flowed down the shallow ravine with intervals held by feel. Muzzles went down when boots stepped across bodies and came back up, the moment lines cleared. Short halts confirmed arcs and adjusted feet so no barrel dragged against stone. Eye protection fogged at the edges and needed quick swipes that never broke muzzle awareness. Bennett caught a thin thread and made it count. She shifted half a meter behind a boulder. Keyed the ANPRC 152 and heard Overwatch 7 through static. Authentication came first. Then a single line that the weather remained hard and no air support was inbound yet. She logged the time as about 3:25 p.m. and tucked the battery back to warm. Ground marks went live in the pickup zone only when the file approached. IR strobes faced inward, not outward. And chem lights stayed shielded under gloves. Until the birds were committed, the marks formed a T that crews knew how to read, even in a whiteout. No visible cues were offered to the tree line unless you wore the right glasses. Aviation entered the bowl on the edge of what was safe. 2 UA-60M Black Hawks worked the approach with crews who had flown days like this and respected them. Pilots briefed wave-off criteria and held a power margin for the instant where sight would betray them. They promised to transition from instruments to visual only when solid ground references showed, and not a second sooner. Cockpit talk stayed plain and believable. Power set. Visual references in sight. Whiteout cues. Wave off if no visual by the gate. Committing. The aircraft circled once to test references. Then committed to a short landing that would not give the storm time to change the rules. Rotors churned snow into a new whiteout that forced calm. Slow movement on the ground. Sergeant Jackson, crew chief, ran the ramp like a checklist, with hands and eyes that had done this before. Door gunners scanned the tree line and called light movement, but held fire for positive identification. Brooks kept the perimeter tight, while Monroe confirmed no friendly forces were forward of the ravine. Kane managed ammunition and staggered reloads, so no 2 rifles went silent together. Casualties moved first, because that is how you keep people alive. Specialist Mark Rivera was wrapped in a hypothermia kit with a heat pack against the chest and loaded on a litter with straps checked by feel. Weapons sat on safe. Muzzles down. Slings secure. Fingers straight. Jackson called ready only when seats locked and straps bit deep. Ava covered the rear arc with the TAC-50 on safe and glassed the distance for a counterattack. She saw a possible movement at 400 meters and felt the pull of an ego shot. The mission was to leave. Not to paint the snow. She kept the selector on safe and let the glass move on. The unit avoided chatter that would turn into confusion. Short lines only. Contact faint north. Hold fire unless positive. Move on my mark. The team flowed to the birds in 2 lifts as if they had rehearsed this specific valley for weeks. Brooks confirmed numbers with Jackson with a line that counted lives. 12 souls. 4 hurt. 2 priority. 6 walking. Pilots acknowledged with a brief reply and held power rather than relax into the landing. They were ready to wave off if visual dropped. And everyone on the ground moved like that was true. The first Black Hawk set down in partial whiteout, and Jackson signaled clear left and clear right. The second aircraft orbited short to avoid rotor wash conflict and committed when the first lifted. Details that matter for safety kept the work clean. Seatbelts clicked. Headsets tapped. Quick straps went over litters and held where they had to hold. Rivera's color was poor at first, but warmed under cabin air and blankets that trapped what heat he had left. Bennett passed a last update to Overwatch 7 that the element was loading now and would call feet wet or crossing the line when clear. The reply was short and to the point. Window is tight. Depart as planned. She kept the handset under her collar and let the battery ride against body heat as the door closed. Ava's role stayed consistent with Overwatch discipline. She held position on the snow until the last lift. Selector on safe. Glassing for a counterattack that could still form under chaos. She collapsed the TAC-50 with no wasted motion, stowed the magazine, and moved on Jackson's signal. The last seconds felt like trained actions performed in a long practiced order. A final sector check caught a small gap and closed it with a boot step. Kane gave a nod that carried a full sentence without a word. Monroe sent a brief look that said the line was clear and the movement could begin. Brooks counted heads with his fingers and gave the lift call as the second Black Hawk settled. The door gunner swept the tree line once more and set the weapon safe for the climb. Power came up and the rotors grabbed the air like a hand finding a rail. Snow blinded the open door for a moment and then blurred into gray. Jackson braced his forearm on the frame and called rising. Stable. Clear in a voice that carried calm. The pilot kept a shallow climb to avoid losing visual references. Then transitioned to instruments when the cues faded. The second aircraft mirrored the profile and tucked in trail with safe separation. Radio settled into the simple rhythm of crews who had done this before. Climb. Turn. Check ice. Maintain spacing. Report when through the pass. Inside the aircraft, the physical feel was real and immediate. The thump of rotors pressed at chest level and made straps hum. Gear shook in rhythm with the airframe and then calmed as altitude built. Relief tasted like metal and cold plastic, and the first warm breath in too long. Ava sat still with the rifle case between her knees and watched the white field fall away through a small window. She kept the selector mindset even with the weapon cased. Safe off target. Safe on target only when needed. The habits that kept her alive on the ground kept her centered in the air. The outcome became concrete as the valley tipped behind them. 12 people were airborne. No new casualties. The enemy was disorganized and late to respond because shock takes time to explain itself to a net without a leader. Air support remained grounded elsewhere, but was not needed here. Timing and discipline had carried the day. Not volume or luck. No one cheered in the cabin. But breaths eased into something closer to normal. Short lines passed between seatmates and meant more than complete sentences ever could. Bennett's shoulders dropped as the radio cleared for a few seconds, and Overwatch confirmed receipt of status. Kane allowed himself one look at his team, and then turned back to the basics that never change. Water. Heat. Check, fingers, and toes. Brooks kept his headset on and eyes on the map for the shortest path through the weather. Monroe logged a quick note that the ravine route had worked as advertised, with sector coverage holding under movement. She marked the feint's timing and the way it disguised motion without burning magazines. She closed the notebook and let her head rest against the seat for 2 breaths. Then she looked forward again because the day was not finished. The first aircraft called the pass clear and the second confirmed spacing. The door gunner relaxed the grip while keeping the scan alive. Jackson rechecked straps with a firm tug that made clicks under gloves. The cabin warmed by degrees until faces found color again. Ava let her breath fall into a normal rhythm and wrote 3 lines that would become part of the after-action review. Wind near 22 knots from the northwest. Hold near 1 mil left. Elevation near 0.7 mil at 300 meters with a 100 meter zero. The pencil scratched in small letters that did not waste space. She kept the same ethical frame, even now that the crisis felt smaller. Use only what is needed. Move only as fast as reality allows. Trust the small procedures that stack into survival. The exfil had not been luck. It had been competence, coordination, and the quiet choice to value procedure over noise. The aircraft crossed out of the worst of the weather and leveled toward a secure base that felt like another planet. The mountains fell behind in white folds that hid what had just happened. The team did not need to speak about it yet. They sat with the work and let the work speak to them. The last image was simple and deserved to be. White mountains slid by under 2 helicopters that had flown the line and stayed inside their margins. A crew chief gave a small thumbs up that said the straps held, and the people did too. A team rode home together because they did the small things right when it mattered most. The 2 UH-60M Blackhawks leveled out above the valley, while the cabins settled into a steady drum of rotor and airflow. Sergeant Jackson moved the aisle 1 strap at a time and called clear with the calm of habit. Door gunners kept their arcs and scanned through slits of white where ground reference flickered and vanished. The pilots rode instruments through patches of whiteout and waited for honest cues before trusting the windows. Captain Daniel Brooks stayed on a headset and kept radio rhythm short and calm. Overwatch 7 asked to confirm Raven 6 present, and Brooks replied with the same steady tone. Affirm. Raven 6 operational. No names were used on the open net and no details were offered. The conversation returned to weather, route, and fuel in 3 lines that fit the mission and nothing else. Private First Class Emma Bennett sent a brief status that matched procedure and time. Feet clear of terrain at about 2:30 p.m. Estimated landing at about 3:15 p.m. She warmed the handset against her collar and tucked the spare battery into an inner pocket. The net stayed sparse so crews could hear what mattered. Weapons sat on safe with muzzles down and slings secure as the adrenaline bled away. Specialist Mark Rivera lay wrapped in a hypothermia kit, while a medic checked skin color and kept a hand on a carotid pulse. Staff Sergeant Noah Kane worked down the bench and counted fingers and toes with quick taps. He handed warm fluids in small sips and watched for the slow return of pink. Lieutenant Julia Monroe wrote in a small waterproof notebook with practice block letters. She recorded the ravine route, the faint timing, and the sector calls that prevented overlap when visibility closed. Her pencil capped with a gloved thumb after each line to keep the tip from snapping in the cold. She paused only to check a strap, then returned to the notes that would inform the next fight. Ava Ward sat near the door with the Macmillan TAC 50, cased and strapped between her knees. She looked out at the white field sliding by and let her pulse settle into a slow, even line. She did not talk about shots or distance or luck. The team did not celebrate and did not need to. Relief felt like steady air and the sound of engines holding power. Breathing evened out along the benches until voices returned to normal volume. Gloves loosened 1 notch and then tightened again because the cabin could still chill fast. People leaned back against armor plates and let the quiet do most of the work. The landing came in light snow that made the runway look soft and endless. Ground crew guided the birds with shielded lights and moved slow to keep references honest. Jackson braced at the door and called clear left and clear right as skids touched. The pilots flared, settled, and kept rotors turning while the ramps dropped. Medical personnel met the aircraft at the ramps and took Rivera first with a litter and warm blankets. 2 lightly injured soldiers followed and moved under their own power with a hand on each elbow. Brooks stepped to the edge and accounted for 12 people, stating 4 hurt and 2 priority. Jackson and the gunners handed off safely and walked the aircraft to parking with brief hand signals. The flow stayed simple and correct from ramp to building. Safe weapons, offload, accountability, move to debrief and medical in that order with no steps missed. Ava was escorted to a small room where a doctor checked for early hypothermia and cold injury. Capillary refill was timed at the nail bed and sensation tested with a light touch on fingertips. Dexterity got a quick check with a pen cap and a zipper pull. The exam stayed routine and professional while the doctor reminded her that cold takes a toll even on the best. And Ava answered that she was fine, focused, and steady. In the debrief room, the language returned to facts and sequence. Brooks spoke to weather, terrain, and the ammunition status that had trended toward half. Monroe outlined communications, failures, and the sector geometry that prevented fratricide when the window opened. Kane gave the ammunition flow in numbers and minutes, and noted the moment the enemy command structure failed. Overwatch 7 met Brooks off the main net and kept the conversation inside the walls that handle secrets. Raven 6 was confirmed as a protected asset who operates as Overwatch in austere environments. The mission covered her insertion, and the element provided escort and survival depth without being told the full file. Identity and nickname were not to be used outside controlled channels, and capability would be discussed only in training contexts. Brooks processed the briefing in silence, until the only things left were the parts he could control. Training stays sharp. Trust is earned again tomorrow. Duty continues in simple, repeatable steps. He nodded once and asked for weather updates rather than anything that sounded like story. Ava met Brooks in a quiet corner, where the air smelled like hydraulic fluid and wool. She did not give a speech. She credited the team for holding sectors, for ammo discipline, and for buying time that allowed 2 shots to matter. Brooks kept the reply on results and said that 12 people left that mountain, that 2 shots created space, and that discipline carried the day. Her background came through in a clean paragraph that fit the file and nothing more. She trained through the Special Operations Target Interdiction course, now known as the Special Forces Sniper course, under Master Sergeant Raymond Walsh. She completed cold weather packages in Alaska and ran joint winter lanes with Canadian Rangers. She learned to read wind through snow crystals, to hold in mills, to manage cold bore shift, and to shoot between heartbeats. The ethic stayed as simple as the work. Remove the link that causes the most harm. Protect the team. Get everyone home. It matched what had happened on the mountain and did not need more words. Recognition and anonymity were handled the way policy expects. An officer suggested a decoration in careful language. Overwatch noted that some awards for Raven 6 are processed at a classification level that avoids public attention, and that unit credit would reflect survival under extreme weather and maintained fire control. Ava declined any public ceremony and committed to a full after-action report with wind, elevation holds, and observations logged for training use inside the program. The team space gave room for a brief, human beat that did not cost time. Monroe checked on Rivera and added one last note about battery rotation for radios in cold weather so the lesson would not fade. Kane placed a fresh pair of gloves on a young rifleman's pack without comment. Bennett sat with a warm drink until the shake finally left her hands and the color came back. Brooks stood over a map and then over his soldiers and said only that they did the work right. It landed better than praise would have. People nodded and went back to clearing weapons and checking gear, because that is what soldiers do after a day like this. Presence replaced speeches, and everyone understood the meaning. Ava walked the line with the same calm as on the mountain and made eye contact with each person. She nodded once and moved on. No one needed a story to feel what the discipline had bought. Quiet competence became the compliment that stayed. She found a bench in the armory and opened the case. The Macmillan TAC-50 came apart into the same honest pieces and was cleaned with the same patient hands. She noted the cold marks on the stock tape and copied them into the notebook that rode in her chest pocket. Wind near 22 knots from the northwest. Hold near, 1 mil left. Elevation near 0.7 mil at 300 meters, with a 100-meter zero. 3 lines went into the record, and the notebook closed with a small click that felt like closure. Overwatch delivered a stand-down order for 72 hours, so nerves and gear could come back to baseline. Medical cleared the team with instructions on rest, rewarming, and hydration, then sent them to hot food and to quiet. The hangars took on that end-of-day echo that lives between machines and concrete. The night grew colder and more still as the last tasks wrapped. Snow fell on the tarmac, in patient lines that filled footprints and softened edges. The aircraft cooled in the dark while ground crews checked covers and logged times. The base lights reflected off the gray sky and made the world small and warm at the edges. Precision and discipline save lives when rank and weather fail. That was the message that remained when the noise drained away. A small group of soldiers walked toward light and heat because they did the small things right when it mattered most. Ava stayed last in the corridor, a step behind the others, rifle case in hand, steady and unremarkable to anyone who does not know what quiet skill looks like at work. The aircraft hum fades to a low haze, and the base lights settle into the night like steady beacons. The snow is quiet now, and breathing finally matches the calm. We are off the mountain, and the work has been handed to warm rooms and routine checks. This is the place for a simple question that matters. When orders go silent and time is almost gone, do you hold the line or act to save lives? That choice sat heavy in the cold, and it sits here now. It is not about noise or swagger. It is about judgment, duty, and the kind of courage that lives in small, exact steps. Think about 3 words that describe Ava Ward and why those words matter to you in real life. Maybe you write calm, disciplined, precise. Maybe you choose patient, prepared, professional. Share your 3 words in the comments and tell us where they show up in your day when pressure rises. Tell us how you balance discipline and initiative when the stakes are high. Do you wait for the perfect signal, or do you move when the pattern is clear? In the field, she held fire until self-defense, and the mission demanded action. In our own work, the line between waiting and moving matters just as much. If you want a gentle next step that fits the tone of this story, here is an idea. We can break down wind holds and mills in a simple way anyone can follow. We can explain cold bore shift and why the first round behaves differently in real air. We can walk through a breathing cadence of 4 in and 8 out that anyone can practice in a safe and legal setting. We will keep references accurate to United States Army practice. And we will keep the language clear for non-military listeners. If we mention times, we will say 2:30 p.m. or 3:15 p.m. so it sounds like a real conversation. The point is to turn big words into small skills. Those small skills add up when weather and stress make everything harder. If this story helped you breathe a little easier, tag a friend who needs a reminder that quiet competence changes outcomes. Keep the discussion respectful and useful rather than hot takes that fade by morning. The point is service, not spotlight. Share a moment from your life where steady choices under pressure made the difference. You can talk about a shift where a fast call kept a team safe. You can talk about a classroom where patience turned confusion into a plan. You can talk about a home where calm words kept fear from running the room. These stories teach more than any speech can. Ava's part in this is simple and worth keeping simple. She read the pattern, held for wind in mills, lifted for elevation, and pressed the trigger straight to the rear only when the facts lined up. She returned the rifle to safe when she was off target. Then she went back to work so others could do theirs. If you stayed to the end, thank you for your time and attention. Precision and discipline save lives when rank and weather fail. That line is true in the field and in the hallway and in the places that never make a headline. It is the reason small procedures matter. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories about craft, calm, and courage. Or share this with one person who needs a steady voice today. We will be here with the next piece that turns hard lessons into useful habits. Walk from the cold into the heat, with that lesson still in the air.